slavery in America today. In this book, Bales and Soodalter present a comprehensive account of modern-day slavery in the U.S., explaining how tens of thousands of people are currently living in slavery inside our borders. Mr. Soodalter is also a historian with degrees in American history, education, and American folk culture. In 2006, he wrote Hanging Captain Gordon, The Life and Trial of an American Slave Trader. This book examines the life of Nathaniel Gordon, a sea captain and the only American to be hanged for slave trading. His next book, Annex Cuba, A History of the United States' Nation-Long Obsession with its Caribbean neighbor, is due out in 2010. Mr. Soodalter has also written for Smithsonian, Civil War Times, Portland, New York Archives, and True West, and is a featured columnist for America's Civil War. Please welcome Mr. Ron Soodalter.
Good morning. Thank you for coming, and thank you for having me. For 2 years, 12 Mexican and Guatemalan field workers in South Florida were enslaved by the Navarretes, a family of traffickers. The family beat them, chained them to a pole, and at night locked them in boxes and truck trailers with little food and no plumbing, while keeping them in ever-increasing debt. During the day, they were taken to work in the tomato fields of two of Florida's biggest growers, 6Ls and Pacific. When their day's work was done, they were taken back to their prison. Finally, one of the workers broke a hole in the trailer wall and escaped, got a ladder, and helped his friends to do likewise. The Navarretes were arrested and sent to jail. In February, were ordered to pay the survivors nearly $250,000 in restitution. Officials at 6Ls and Pacific could not be reached for comment. Assistant U.S. Attorney Doug Malloy in Florida called it one of Southwest Florida's, quote, ugliest slavery cases ever, and added, we have a number of similar and ongoing investigations. And yet, despite the successful prosecution of 7 slavery cases involving over 1,000 victims, and despite pressure from such organizations as Amnesty International USA, until recently, Governor Christ refused to acknowledge the presence of slavery in Florida's fields. American humorist Will Rogers once said, "It's not that we're so dumb. It's just that what we know ain't so." Certain things we know to be true. We know that the South kept slaves and the North fought a righteous war of liberation. We know that the slave trade was legal right up into the Civil War, and we know that the Emancipation Proclamation freed all the slaves and that the United States has been slavery-free ever since. These things we know, and none of it is true. On the other hand, most Americans do not know that slavery not only exists in the world today, it flourishes. Slavery is legal nowhere in the world, and yet is practiced nearly everywhere. Somewhere around 27 million people are in bondage in the world today, and that's over twice the number as were trafficked in chains during the entire 350 years of the African slave trade. Human trafficking is one of the most profitable criminal enterprises of our time, right up there with drugs and guns, and is responsible for tens of billions of dollars in revenues worldwide annually. And you'll say to me, well, it's all those backward third world nations, as we used to call them, emerging countries. And you'd be partly right, but it's also such civilized countries as England, Scotland, Ireland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, France, Italy, Spain, Israel, Japan, China, and the United States. Most Americans do not know that slavery is alive and more than well right here, thriving in the dark, and practiced in forms and places you would never expect. The simple truth is humans keep slaves. We always have. Historically, we Americans see ourselves as the world's foremost messengers and practitioners of personal freedom. And yet there has never been a single day on this continent since its European discovery right up to the present moment, where slavery has not been present. In 1493, on his second voyage across the Atlantic and before even establishing a colony, Christopher Columbus enslaved hundreds of Taino Indians and sent them home in chains to Spain. The wave of armed and armored conquistadores that followed brought a plague of butchery and enslavement upon the Indians that destroyed entire cultures. With that age-old rationale that any foreign society is inferior to one's own, the Spaniards used the "God told me to do it" argument to visit a plague of enslavement, butchery on the natives in their quest for treasure. They called it La Guerra de Sangre y Fuego, the war of blood and fire. Sometimes they simply called it pacification. Pardon me. When the Spaniards found that the Indians were dying in droves from brutality and European disease, their king gave his consent for them to sail to Africa for slaves, bozales as they were called, beginning what would become the 3.5-century-long transatlantic trade. Ultimately, every European power claiming land in the New World followed Spain's example. French, Dutch, Portuguese, and English settlers from Canada to the southernmost tip of South America owned slaves. Slave labor became an accepted social and economic reality in North America. It's a safe bet that the majority of Americans believe the curse of slavery ended with the Civil War and the laws that presumably banished it from our shores forever. Nothing could be further from the truth. Slavery continued more quietly and on a smaller scale, but without pause. While legal emancipation might have come with the 13th Amendment, that did nothing to stop the Southern planters from re-enslaving countless thousands of African Americans. Crops in the South still needed planting and cultivating and harvesting, and there was a vast population of unemployed former slaves. Planters instituted a system that was as close to the old slavery as possible, but this time with a few new wrinkles. And this time it was called peonage, and it was simply a form of debt bondage slavery. Thousands of blacks and poor whites were duped or coerced into signing contracts as field workers or sharecroppers. Farm owners would hold their pay, and the workers would be obliged to do their shopping at the company's store using tickets rather than money. When their annual contracts expired, they found that the crops they raised never paid the debts they owed. Although these debts were often fraudulent or impossibly inflated, the penalty for non-payment was jail or worse. With the law on the planter's side, the only alternative was to stay on the land and try to work off the debt, which never seemed to lessen or disappear. Worst of all, the debt passed from parent to child, binding families to the land with no hope of advancement or escape. Each year became a frustrating, spirit-crushing effort to break even. A full federal ban on peonage slavery was not passed until 1948, and still it persisted across much of the South into the civil rights era of the 1960s. On a much broader scale, whenever there weren't enough willing or available native sons to do the nation's work, we imported our labor force. During World War I, when our boys were off fighting in France, we welcomed thousands of Mexican workers, often right into forced labor situations, only to throw them out after the war ended. The pattern repeated itself prior to the Depression and again during World War II. In 1943, the government formalized its approach to foreign labor by creating what was called the H-2 or guest worker program to aid in providing temporary jobs in the Spanish fields. The concept was nothing new. Bring them in when we need them, throw them out when we don't. From its beginning, the program was characterized by inequity and brutality. As recently as 1986, here in Florida, Jamaican cane cutters who attempted a work stoppage over poor conditions were set upon by armed police with attack dogs acting at the employer's behest. The workers were brutalized, loaded onto planes, and shipped home. This incident became known as the Dog Wars. Slavery in America hit its lowest ebb in the 1960s, due largely to the nation's new outlook on civil rights. But beginning in the 80s and then exploding in the 1990s, slavery came back with a vengeance. With the end of the Cold War and the tripling of the global population from 2 to more than 6 billion, borders around the world collapsed as people were caught up in a frustrating, desperate fight for survival and became targets for human traffickers. And once again, America became a prime destination for slavers. Most Americans' concept of slavery comes right out of Gone with the Wind or Roots or Uncle Tom's Cabin. The whip, the chains, the crack of the auctioneer's gavel. Well, that was one form of slavery. The slavery plaguing America today takes different forms, but make no mistake, it is the real deal. Where the law sanctioned the slavery of the 1800s, today it's illegal. Where masters once took pride in the ownership of slaves as a sign of wealth and status, today's slaves are kept hidden, making it all the harder to rescue the victims and punish the offenders. Where the slaves in America were once mostly, if not entirely, African or African American, today we have, for want of a better term, equal opportunity slavery. Slaves come in all races, all types, all ethnicities. We are, if anything, totally democratic when it comes to enslaving our fellow man. This is capitalism at its absolute worst. Before the Civil War, slaves cost a lot. In the 1850s, you would have to pay around $1,200 for a slave, which in today's currency comes to between $40,000 and $50,000. This level of investment predisposed the owners to take care of their human property, at least to the extent that it ensured their longevity and productivity. We're talking economics here, people, not humanitarianism or kindness. You would no more destroy a property of such value than you would neuter a seed bull or cripple a good plow horse. Today's slave can be bought for as little as $100. This makes the modern slave not only affordable, but also disposable. All forms of slavery are horrific. Today's slavery, however, is one of the more diabolical to come along in the thousands of years in which we have been enslaving our fellows, especially when you consider that it doesn't exist without what we refer to as a bundle of other crimes, including document fraud, assault, torture, rape, and sometimes homicide, to name just a handful. So how many slaves are we actually talking about here? Well, according to a U.S. State Department survey, somewhere around 17,000 foreign nationals are trafficked into the United States from at least 35 countries and enslaved here every year. Some victims are smuggled here from across the Mexican or Canadian borders. Others arrive at our major airports daily carrying either real or falsified papers. Overwhelmingly, they come here on the promise of a better life from Africa, Asia, India, Latin America, the Soviet Republic, looking for the opportunity to work and prosper in America. Many come in the hope of earning enough money to support or send for their families. They fork over their life savings and go heavily into debt to people who have made them promises they have absolutely no intention of keeping. And when they arrive here, instead of opportunity, they find bondage. They can be found, or more accurately, not found, in all 50 states, working as farmhands, domestics, sweatshop and factory laborers, construction and restaurant workers, gardeners, victims of sexual exploitation. These people do not represent a class of poorly paid employees working at jobs they might not like. They exist specifically to work. They are kept under the threat and the reality of violence. They are not allowed to leave. Control over their lives has been taken from them. Historically and legally, they are slaves. Today we use the term human trafficking, but make no mistake, it is the slave trade. Nor are native-born Americans immune from slavers. Many are stolen or enticed from the streets of their own cities and towns. Some sources, including the federal government, estimate in the hundreds of thousands the number of U.S. citizens, primarily children and adolescents, at risk of being caught up in slavery annually. What is particularly infuriating is the fact that this is a crime that, as a general rule, goes unpunished. For the moment, let's accept the government's number of 17,000 foreign nationals trafficked here into slavery a year. Coincidentally, there are also about 17,000 murders committed in the U.S. annually. Now, the government's numbers specify that the percentage of successful prosecutions of murder cases is around 70%. So somewhere between 11 and 12,000 homicides get cleared every year. By our same government's estimates, the annual percentage of trafficking and slavery cases solved is less than 1%. In 2007, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division obtained 103 convictions for human trafficking. We don't yet know how President Obama will respond to the trafficking crisis. It's really too soon to tell. He and Secretary Clinton have said the right things and seem to be heading in the right direction. We do know, however, that the response under the 8 years of the Bush administration was inadequate in the extreme. In a speech on trafficking, Bush once said, quote, "We're beginning to make good, substantial progress. The message is getting out. We're serious. And when we catch you, you'll find out we're serious. We're staying on the hunt." Unquote. Strong words. At least he didn't say mission accomplished. But the unvarnished truth is, with less than 1% of the bad guys apprehended and less than 1% of the victims freed, it sounds a lot more like spin than fact. The U.S. government, when it does address the subject of human trafficking, tends to focus primarily on the area of sexual exploitation. More sensational than most other forms of slavery, its victims are subjected to serial rape, physical injury, psychological damage, and constant exposure to sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV. But terrible though forced prostitution is, there are many other forms of slavery thriving right under our noses. If you don't see them, you're in good company, because neither do most of our police or public officials. The plight of enslaved domestics factors large and accounts for a significant number of America's slaves. In late May 2006, the Justice Department announced the conviction of a Wisconsin couple for human trafficking. According to the charges, quote, "They had held the victim in a condition of servitude for 19 years, requiring her to work long hours, 7 days a week. They threatened her with deportation and imprisonment if she disobeyed them, and forced her to hide in the basement when people entered the house." The couple was convicted on forced labor charges and of harboring an undocumented alien. They each received 4 years in jail. Meanwhile, where does a woman go to reclaim 19 lost years? Agriculture is another major area of human trafficking. There's an unknown number of victims of forced labor growing and picking our fruit and vegetables. They come here looking for a decent wage and instead are enslaved by crime syndicates and families, and sometimes inadvertently by our own government, in such states as Florida, North and South Carolina, Colorado, and Georgia. The good news is there have actually been some inroads made recently in the area of agricultural servitude. When Taco Bell refused to stop buying tomatoes picked by slaves, the South Florida-based coalition of Immokalee workers organized a march, a boycott, and a hunger strike. and at one point sponsored a campout on Taco Bell's corporate lawn. They sponsored a Ban the Bell campaign in the colleges across the nation, which resulted in this fast food operation being driven from campuses. And finally, after 4 years of stonewalling, Taco Bell sat down and signed an agreement which, among other stipulations, stated that they would no longer buy produce picked by slaves or abused workers. Only within the past several months, such major purchasers as McDonald's, A&W, Long John Silver, Pizza Hut, Whole Foods, Chipotle, and Burger King have followed suit and signed the agreement. And last month, Compass Food, the world's largest food service organization, came aboard with all 10,000 of its companies. There are still holdouts, such as Wendy's and Walmart's and Quiznos, but that little workers' coalition, with the support of the public, will bring them around as well. The message is clear. Slavery and worker abuse will not be tolerated, not here, not now, not ever. In researching our book, The Slave Next Door, Kevin Bales and I were stunned to discover the many and varied ways in which traffickers ply their trade and make their living. While the greatest number of slaves in America derive from the three categories I mentioned, agricultural slavery, sexual exploitation, and domestic servitude, there is no lack of ingenuity on the part of traffickers when it comes to exploiting their victims. Here's one for you. What do Chinese acrobats, deaf Mexicans, and an African boys' choir have in common? In a word, slavery. Imagine the shock among the Las Vegas community when they discovered last year that an entire Chinese acrobatic troupe was being held against their will, forced to work 2 shows a day, fed little, and paid nothing. The break in the case came when one of the enslaved women managed to escape and go to the police. It turned out their keeper, a 38-year-old man named Yu Ji Li, had promised them good pay and opportunity if they were to bring their skills to America, and instead he gave them slavery. He confiscated their passports, which is a common ploy among human traffickers, and had them sleeping 6 to a room. When they were not performing, he rented them out to another man who used them to clean and renovate houses and do yard work. Lee told the police he made only $30,000 a year. In fact, the labor of this troupe earned him 2 houses, 4 vans, and more than $140,000 in the bank. Of the 14 acrobats who were kept against their will, 5 were children. An attractive young Mexican woman named Adriana Pauletti was a major player in a particularly egregious family-run human trafficking ring. It came to be referred to as the deaf Mexicans case. For 10 years, Adriana traveled to the poor neighborhoods of her native Mexico and enticed their deaf young people with stories of a better life in El Norte. The stories she told them were a lie. The Paulettis, themselves a deaf family from Mexico, made a thriving business of illegally importing deaf and hearing impaired young people from Mexico into California and then transporting them to Chicago and New York City and enslaving them there as street peddlers. In New York City, 57 of the deaf Mexicans were crammed into 2 small rundown apartments and forced to sleep on the floor or on bare mattresses. They were threatened, abused, and beaten as a matter of course. Some of the women systematically raped. Every day, 7 days a week, they were each given 100 cheap trinkets and sent out to sell them for $1 apiece. Some of the men were given 200 trinkets. They were all told not to return until every trinket was sold. And so for 12 to 18 hours daily, they would walk the city streets or stand on corners staring at the sidewalk, holding out their trinkets. Or they would ride the subways, eyes cast down, leaving with the riders a keychain or a pen and a little worn card reading, "I am deaf," and coming back to retrieve either the card and the trinket or the dollar. If they came home at night with any trinkets left, they were beaten, shocked with stun guns, denied food and water, or locked out. The Pauletti family made a fortune. Just do the math. With most of the 57 victims bringing home at least $100 a day, the family was taking in a minimum of $5,000 daily in New York City alone. So why didn't the victims simply run away? After all, their knowledge of the city streets and subway systems was staggering. However, their freedom to roam at will was an illusion. The victims could not communicate with the world outside their group. They didn't speak, write, or sign in English, and in many cases couldn't read or write at all. And they were living under the constant reality of violence. Neighbors later told the authorities of, quote, a nightly horror show of barefoot women clad only in nightgowns fleeing from the houses with men in pursuit, of babies crying unattended, of walls vibrating from slamming doors and pounding fists. When the ring was finally broken, it was not because of the various public servants who had, in fact, witnessed the conditions under which these people lived and had done nothing. It was because the victims finally decided they had had enough. After several unsuccessful attempts to make themselves understood by the local police, 4 of the men were befriended by an older deaf American, a Good Samaritan. Although he spoke no Spanish, he helped them write a letter describing their enslavement, and at 4 in the morning they walked into the Queens police station and handed the letter to the desk sergeant. What followed was a pre-dawn raid, the arrest of the Paulettis, or at least those who could be found, and a long, difficult path towards mental and physical healing for the victims. As one senior member of the Justice Department observed, they will need a support network all their lives. Trafficking, more often than not, entails a betrayal of trust. When the betrayer is a minister of the church and the victims are children, the crime is particularly vicious. In the 1990s, a Texas minister traveling in Zambia heard a local boys' choir and asked their parents if he might take them back to Texas where he would stage concerts for them. The money they earned, he promised, would be used to build schools in their village and provide living essentials for the families. They gave their permission, the boys went with them, and the concerts were indeed successful, filling churches and halls, and the money poured in. Little of it ever reached Zambia. The minister kept nearly every dollar the choir earned. He forced the boys to sing as many as 7 concerts a day, locked them in a trailer when they weren't singing. He denied them medicine when sick, food if they dared to complain, forced them to dig him a swimming pool by hand in the heat of the Texas sun, told them if they tried to escape they would be severely punished, and when any of the boys rebelled, they were deported in shame to Zambia, where their families, on the word of the minister, disowned them. Finally, immigration officials questioned some of the boys, and when they found out what had been occurring at the minister's house, they were incredulous. A church choir enslaved by a man of God. Such things simply do not happen, certainly not here, certainly not now. However, the facts were borne out, and the group was rescued. Of the 11 boys in the choir, 10 elected to remain in the United States. Most have not done well. Shame and alcoholism are a common thread, and there is little or no contact with their families in Zambia. One of the boys, given Kachepa, is a rare exception. Only 11 and an orphan when trafficked by the minister. He lived in slavery for 2 years. After his liberation, he was adopted by a Texas family and introduced to a new life as a middle-class American. Since then, he has graduated college, entered dental school. He travels throughout the country with his adopted mother, talking about his experience and about the reality of slavery in today's America. By the way, in case you thought this issue does not touch you personally, guess again. There is a chance that the clothes you wear and the food you eat have been tainted by slavery. Cotton, the symbol of bondage in the Old South, is now being picked by slaves on 3 continents. The orange juice and tomato you might have had with your lunch yesterday could have come to you from a Mexican or Guatemalan immigrant working under coercion. The rug you walk on at home could have been woven in India, Pakistan, Nepal by one of 100,000 child slaves, 8, 9, 10 years old. Cell phones and laptops require an element called tantalum. It comes from an ore that is mined in the Congo, often by slaves. So does this mean that all tomatoes, all oranges, rugs, cotton shirts, cell phones, and laptops are the product of slave labor? Absolutely not. But some are, and you just never know. It's that insidious. Of the relatively few cases in which slaves are rescued, only around 1/3 result from government action. Another third comes from the victim escaping on his or her own, and the last third is as a result of the efforts of what we call Good Samaritans. In other words, us. As often as not, a concerned citizen will notice that something isn't quite right about that housekeeper next door. Perhaps she cries a lot, looks to be bruised, keeps to herself, rarely leaves the house. A call to the authorities can bring about an investigation, but generally, sadly, we don't know what to look for. And we are not alone. The authorities generally don't have any idea what slavery looks like either. A minor who is in prostitution is automatically defined by federal law as a victim of human trafficking. And yet, without the proper training, a policeman can look at an underage prostitute and he sees a prostitute. He arrests her, and out of fear, she says nothing, and so she is victimized for the 3rd time. First by the trafficker, then by the Johns, and finally by the system that should be structured to rescue and help, but instead ensures that the cycle continues. There is major federal legislation in place. It's called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the TVPA, and it was passed in 2000. Every 2 or 3 years it undergoes a reauthorization. This happened most recently last December, and many good things were added to the existing law, but much remains to be done. Clearly, what is needed is greater awareness, organized training programs for law enforcement and for us, greater cooperation between and among government agencies and non-governmental organizations, a lot more money, and a much more equitable system of distributing it. Thus far, 43 out of 50 states have passed anti-human trafficking laws of their own, but most of them focus mainly, if not entirely, on the issue of prostitution and sex slavery. However, no one form of slavery is more horrific than another, and we simply cannot afford to ignore the other types of bondage. Also, the state laws usually concentrate on catching and punishing the traffickers and ignore the vital issue of long-term support and counseling for the survivors of slavery. It is essential that Americans are made aware that this blight exists in our country today. Without an educated public, there can be no elimination of slavery. Every day, newspapers print stories of human trafficking here and abroad. The amount of material is impressive, and yet we remain oblivious. We can't solve a problem we don't understand. Here's a suggestion for you. Go on your computer, go to Google. They have a news alerts section. Type in human trafficking. You'll receive automatic daily updates from newspapers around the country and the world. It is one of the best ways I know to stay current on the issue. Some recent ones. Conference focuses on ending modern slavery, Jacksonville, Florida. Group works against human trafficking, Toledo, Ohio. Law officers learn of trafficking, Socorro, New Mexico. Grant funds effort to gauge human trafficking, Greenville, North Carolina. Newark hair braiding salon owner pleads guilty to human trafficking. And as of this morning, there were 2 on South Florida. Human trafficking, we all can help victims, Naples, Florida, and Immokalee event geared towards raising awareness. So, certain things we know to be true. We know the crimes of human trafficking and slavery exist in our country, our city, and sometimes the house next door. We know there is a past due need to train and sensitize both civilians and law enforcement to find and approach it with skill and with sensitivity. And we know that without pressure from us, it will not get done. As a society, we tend to look trusting and childlike to our leaders and our institutions for guidance and for salvation. That has never been truer than it is now. And yet, if history has taught us anything, it's that the only hope of forward movement derives from whatever pressure for change we bring to bear upon our leaders and our institutions. America was born with the congenital disease of slavery, and legal or not, it has never left us. Today, we are still conflicted about our distant slave past and its ugly aftermath. We study it, we lament it, we argue it as a haunting presence from our dark history. And yet, while we were looking the other way, slavery in America evolved into a whole new beast that lives in darkness among us, feeds on ignorance and misery. Only through our awareness, our concern, and our commitment can it be driven out. People, this is not a problem that's covered with the dust of the past, and it's clearly within our power to resolve. I find it both challenging and exhilarating to think that we can be the generation to end this nation-long affliction. I thank you.
What do you think this is a crime of? Is it primarily for money or power?
The answer is yes. I think if you had to choose one word to describe the great motivator in most instances of human trafficking, it would be greed. People who are looking for that extra step along the way to not have to spend money, but to make as much as possible. Profit is the underlying motive for most forms of human trafficking. As a matter of fact, I would say for all forms except one, and that is the enslavement of nannies and domestics. Because you're not going to save a ton of money by not paying somebody to come in and clean your house once every week or two. The control that people exercise, men, women, marrieds, singles, over domestics, to keep them in a situation of slavery, of physical abuse, of sexual exploitation, day after day and year after year, goes beyond an issue of trying to make or save a buck. This is something else, and this is something which, since I'm not a shrink, I couldn't begin to explain, but I do know that it's something Kevin calls a spiral of control. You get a hold of somebody and you just sink into this gradually deteriorating situation in which you misuse a former free person. The first case we talk about in this book is the instance of a Texas woman named Sandra Bearden, 32-year-old, married with a child, lived in a suburb of Laredo, Texas. Went to Mexico, asked the parents of a 12-year-old girl if they could take her back, if she could take her back, have her work for her as a housekeeper, promised a good home and a good education. Parents said yes. What this woman did to this 12-year-old child, I'm not even going to ruin your breakfast over. Suffice to say that A, she is serving life in prison right now, and B, the policeman who rescued the woman, who was a seasoned cop, wept on the witness stand. What drives a woman to do that? I don't think that's about profit. But for the most part, the great motivator in human trafficking is making a buck. Other questions?
Ron, okay. You mentioned earlier that through a long and arduous effort, Taco Bell signed on to not receiving tomatoes from slave-generated sources. But then later you pointed out that we don't know what a slave-generated tomato looks like. How much of a win is Taco Bell signing on for that beyond the awareness factor that brings?
It's a great win because the conditions that went along with the agreement were to have representatives from the coalition in the growers' fields, monitoring work conditions, ensuring that the other concessions, which included a 5-day week, reasonable hours, time off, and good treatment, were observed. Also, one of the conditions was the workers got the concession that they could come into the fields and educate, or the coalition rather, could educate the workers in the field as to their rights. So it's a case of monitoring, and their situations are being monitored. So it's more than just a hollow victory. Also, they give them a penny more a pound of tomatoes, which doubles the wage of the migrant worker.
Along with that, is there a website where we can find out the other companies that refuse to make that concession?
Yes, go to the Coalition of Immokalee Workers website, CIW, I think it's .org or .net, and they will give you an update on that website as to who is and who isn't aboard. But it's a prodigious number that they've acquired so far.
And since no one is at the other microphone, I have
Second
another
question,
question.
overage.
I'll pay you double. But you mentioned that there was 17,000 estimated by the U.S. government to be in slavery or something. How is that possible to have those numbers without actually being able to find those people and prosecute the slave traders?
That's the big question. And when I said, let's for the moment accept the government's numbers of 17,000, this is a hidden crime. And the actual factual reality is, how do you count what you can't find? In point of fact, what they try and do is extrapolate from the number of cases they find in specific areas, look at the situation, and the organization that came up with a number, which was between 14,500 and 17,500, was come up with by the CIA. And I'm not sure what their research engine was, but it's a guess. I think anything having to do with the numbers of people enslaved has to be a guess at this point.
I have a question regarding the Obama administration's appointment of a slavery czar in Ambassador Tabaka. And I'm wondering what you would like to see the next step be and what you think his role is going to be moving forward.
I know Lou Tabaka. We're talking about President Obama's appointment of Luis C. Tabaka as the new ambassador at large to monitor and combat human trafficking, the head of the TIP office. It's a crucial, pivotal position in Washington, and one that has been occupied up until now by people with their own agendas, often leaning towards the sex issue. And believe me, I am 100% behind eliminating sexual exploitation. But with Lou Tabaka, you have a man who looks at the broad spectrum of trafficking. He has looked at and prosecuted all sorts of different kinds of cases of human trafficking in America. He walks it like he talks it. And I think that is a major step forward. And I congratulate Obama on picking the absolute best man for the job. Also, every year the State Department comes out with a trafficking in persons, or TIP, report in which the United States State Department evaluates every country in the world on its performance in the area of combating human trafficking, except one. Say again? There you go. For 9 years, we have pointed fingers at other countries and said, you're doing okay, you're not doing so well, and we're going to keep an eye on you, and you were doing so poorly that we're going to start to institute sanctions against you. Put them on one of 3 tiers. Tier 1, acceptable. Tier 2, Tier 2, on a watch list, seriously, and then Tier 3, where you just don't want to be on it. We're very good at pointing fingers. As I said, we are very poor at holding up a mirror. And so finally, Ambassador Tabaka announced this year that in 2010, the United States is going to include itself on the Trafficking in Persons report, which begs a major question, which is, how do we evaluate ourselves? It's going to be interesting to see, but at least it's a positive first step. And I think the fact that this room is filled is major. I applaud you for that. I think it is major that so many things are happening so many places this year to draw attention to this issue. So 30 years ago, the domestic violence issue was just becoming a whisper above a silence. Before that, police would report or would show up at a house that had reported domestic violence. Hey, you got to listen to your husband. You know, come on, guys, straighten this out. You know, this isn't abuse. This isn't domestic violence. This is a quarrel among a husband and a wife. And it took a long time and a whole lot of introspection to come up with an awareness that there is such a thing as domestic violence. 30 years later, it is an accepted campaign, and it is an accepted issue, and one that receives attention worldwide. We are 9 years into a nationally acknowledged campaign on human trafficking, and I think this year has shown more response than any year previously, and I think it's growing exponentially. So I hope that answers your question. Other questions, please?
Yes. I wanted to ask two questions. One was...
Just one. I'm just kidding.
You spoke about the farm workers in Immokalee and about corporate entities like Taco Bell, Whole Foods, and so on.
Yes.
But I wanted to know more about the growers, and if what are the Growers Association in Florida? Do they have a position on slave labor? And the other question is, do you know anything about Central Florida? A lot of this discussion is focused on South and Southwest Florida, but we have a lot of farm worker labor in Central Florida.
You're absolutely right. First question having to do with the growers. The growers have not been wonderful. For one thing, they've been denying the awareness that this has been going on. When you have a guy named Miguel Flores, who goes to jail for having enslaved hundreds of workers on a man's field. And it's in the newspapers on the front page. And this guy is making headlines all over the country. And the growers are so disingenuous as to say, we didn't know anything about it, when they're the ones who contracted Miguel Flores in the first place. You know that there is dissembling going on. You know that they are playing games. The growers have not been good about this. One growers organization did sign a month and a half ago with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. However, the big, the Florida Growers Association? I forget the exact name of it, is still stonewalling. They're still saying things like slavery doesn't exist, and if it did, it wouldn't be in our fields. As far as Central Florida goes, I don't discriminate. As far as I'm concerned, the workers in South Florida move to Central Florida, to the Carolinas, to Georgia, all the way up to Pennsylvania and New York State following the harvest. And often the oppression follows with them. You will find that somebody like Miguel Flores would take these people from camp, two different states, crossing state lines with them in abusive situations. So it's not specific to South Florida, although the federal government did 3 years ago refer to South Florida as, quote, ground zero for human trafficking in America.